and welcome to Stork'd podcast, in which we talk about all things family and family building. I'm your host, Julia. I'm a solo mom by choice, and I am passionate about talking about the ways that families are built and how we choose to define them. This is 4th of July week. Happy 4th of July to those in the U.S. who celebrate it. It is the celebration of our independence, our freedom from tyranny, our freedom from an oppressive ruler, and from colonization. Oof, what an interesting concept when everything is so politically complicated right now in the U.S. I'm recording this podcast in the middle of what is my vacation with my family, and actually in the middle of a little break from Stork'd. I like to take breaks in between seasons, regroup, rejuvenate, rest, etc., because it's not my full-time job. And I just felt really compelled seeing what was going on in the world right now to just talk about the concept of freedom and how it's impacting me personally. And just because I'm watching so much go down politically right now this week, God, it's just all so much. And so I want to talk about freedom. This is the birthday of freedom. And what that means is, while Americans are eating ice cream and waving flags and watching fireworks and celebrating with hot dogs and hamburgers and friends and picnics and outdoors with our loved ones, with our family members, home on vacation with our family members, we're celebrating our rights, our fundamental freedoms, those things that are supposed to be enshrined in the Constitution, our access to the things that are important to us. And for me, that's family. And right now, those rights, those freedoms are really in question. So I mentioned that I'm a solo mom by choice. If you've been following me for some time, you know my origin story. You know that I became a solo mom by choice after a really difficult breakup had me questioning if and when I could ever have a family of my own. And through that questioning, I started talking to people about their family's experiences. How did you build your family? And what does it mean to have your family in this way? And how does that feel? And what's hard about it? What's amazing about it? And things like that. And those conversations were so interesting that I put them into a podcast. And the reason I explored those conversations personally was because I was wrestling with this deep, deep hunger to become a mom and to have a family of my own, and just an uncertainty about how I was going to do it. What if I never get to have kids? What if having kids for me looked like step-parenting somebody else's biological kids, or adopting, or fostering, or doing something else like that? Or what if I chose never to have kids? And so I really was doing this deep, deep, deep exploration around my family life. And that's what became the podcast. And on today, July 4th, the day of freedom, the concept of the freedoms that I have been afforded is really front and center for me. I recognize that I am so deeply privileged to have the life that I have. And what I mean by that is that I got to choose my life. I got to become a solo mom by choice, which is a key component of the title, because I had access to certain rights and certain freedoms that a lot of people don't get and that we might not continue to enjoy going forward. For instance, I got to really wrestle with my own inner demons and figure out what my values were and what was important to me. And I determined personally that the thing that was most important to me was becoming a mom. And it was more important than any other thing, including partnership. And so I got to make choices according to my values and the thing that was most important to me. I got to make the choice to become a solo mom because I had access to insurance in Massachusetts. Fertility treatment insurance is mandatory, which means that my IUI and IVF treatment was covered at a rate that many people don't have in certain states and in many countries. I got to have access to becoming a solo mom by choice because it was financially affordable for me, which is a significant amount of financial freedom. And I got to have access to IVF and infertility treatment because it's legal. It was legal at the time and it continues to be legal in Massachusetts. But that may not always be true in the country in general and specifically in various states. And so when I look at my life and I think about how lucky I am to have had the privilege to choose my life to become a solo mom by choice, I recognize that these freedoms are really, really special and not to be taken for granted. So I'm sort of at a pause in the podcast. I'm really thinking a lot about where it is, what it stands for and where it's going. And I'm wrestling with a couple things. One is I'm currently going through fertility treatments to have my second, and it has been so emotionally draining and physically exhausting that I've been thinking maybe this should be an extended pause from the podcast. Maybe I should take a little time for self-care and rejuvenation and rest. The other thing is that exhaustion is partially driven by just the immense amount of fear I feel for the next generation. I'm 42, but what about the women who are in their 20s and 30s right now? What is fertility treatment going to look like to them going forward? What is family building going to look like to them? Will it be accessible to them? Will they have the same rights that I have? Will they have the same freedoms that I have? What's it going to look like for my son who's 2.5 and his generation and the family he wants to build? Will he have rights and access to the things that make a family? And specifically what I mean by that is I've been looking at the Project 2025 list, and that is a playbook that is very public, that is the agenda for certain members of the conservative right, and it includes things that terrify me to the core. It's a playbook that says first, we're going to come after abortion, and then IVF, and then contraception, and then zero-fault divorce, and then gay marriage, and then. And when I look at that list, I see the word family. We're coming after your family. We're coming after the right to choose your family. We're coming after the right to create the family that you want on your terms. And that's what this podcast is about. When I think about where the podcast was when I started it and where it is now and where I was when the podcast started and where I am now, so much has changed. It's been 4 years, but so much has changed. When I started, I was the depths of the pandemic, and I was in the depths of my personal exploration for how I was going to become a mom. I had just come back from a trip where I was exploring adoption. I had just gone through a deep set of explorations personally and was continuing that exploration. And I was just at the beginning of saying, I think solo parenting's for me, but let me confirm and validate it. So the podcast was largely my own internal exploration. It was my own personal exploration. And I had so many great conversations. I said, let's put it on record. Let's record this and see if anyone listens and finds them valuable. What I have learned over the years is that we as a community, the Stork'd community, actually finds it really valuable to hear other people's stories. What's amazing about the Stork'd guests is they open their heart and they share the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Those moments when they were on their knees in despair, when they were fighting for the family life that they want, or when they were grieving the loss of something like a miscarriage or a lost partner or a lost child, or when they were being told by the people around them that their choices were invalid. The really hard stuff. When they were going through fertility treatments or an adoption journey or some other journey, and it just wasn't going the way they had expected, just the really, really rough stuff. And by sharing their story, what I've heard from the Stork'd community is the Stork'd audience feels less alone hearing other people's journeys. Oh my gosh, my infertility journey, my adoption journey, my choice to never have kids, my divorce, my loss. I felt so alone in those moments. And then I heard a shared story and it made me feel like, okay, there's something else going on here. Maybe there's other people going through this. Maybe I am not terribly alone in my experiences. That's something I hear a lot from the Stork'd community. I also hear that it's expansive, that listening to a Stork'd story can give you perspective around what else is out there, how else to build your family life. And then it gives us permission to say, no thank you to the white picket fence mindset around heterosexual couple with 2.5 kids and a dog. No, thank you to that. I'm going to choose a family life that is right for me. I'm going to marry the love of my life. I'm going to go through a fertility treatment even at 42, even though people are telling me I'm too old. I'm going to do solo parenting, even though so many people tell me that not giving him a dad is a horrible, horrible choice. I'm going to ruin him for the rest of his life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know these stories. You know the things that are holding us back, the things that were holding me back when I was trying to decide what kind of family I wanted were two. They were individual and they were social. What I mean by that is I needed to figure out what I wanted. I needed to figure out what my values were. And I needed to figure out what was truly calling my heart. What was my heart whispering to me? And as it turns out, my heart was whispering that motherhood and particularly solo parenting was really the right path for me. The second thing I had to do is I had to break down the expectations, the shoulds. This is how my family should look. This is how it should feel. This is how it should be manifest or created, or the shoulds. of family building. I had to say no thank you to the shoulds and be comfortable breaking through the barrier of that. And Stork'd, the podcast, for so long was designed to do those two things, to help other people get true with themselves around their true north, around finding their why, around getting clear about what it is that you want from your family life, and break through the barriers of what a life should be. And so the Stork stories were designed to help with the individual, the clarity, and the social, the permissiveness to choose an alternative path. What I never expected, however, is that the barrier now, 4 years later, is not just the individual. It's not just the social. It is increasingly political and legal. Can I access fertility treatments if I need to? Will I still be allowed to marry the person I love? Or are those legal protections, those legal rights going to go away? If I carry a pregnancy and my life is endangered, do I get to choose if I live? Or is a politician choosing that for me? Do I get to choose to use contraception so that I can have a family on my own terms when I am ready? Can I have my career and have kids when I choose to have them, if I choose to have them? Can I have access to contraception? And we take for granted that those freedoms, or I stupidly took for granted that those freedoms were always going to be made available to me until this election year. And now, first I was feeling just so much overwhelm and paralysis about it. I was going through infertility treatments and I was, going through my IUI rounds and then grieving a miscarriage and then going through IVF. And I just couldn't even process all the emotions that seeing the bigger picture required of me. It was just too overwhelming. It's just too frightening. You want to shut down when you see how our rights are being dismantled one by one, how the fabric of our family lives is being torn apart thread by thread, how our choices and our freedoms are being removed, how the construction of our nation is just crumbling. These things are really scary to me. The loss of democracy, as I see it, is really terrifying to me. And the fact that I talk about families all day long and then our choices around what our families could be is diminishing, it is disappearing, is frightening to me. And so I'm looking at where Stork'd was and where it is now and where I was when I started this. I didn't have any kids. I was still trying to figure out what I wanted. I didn't have a podcast. And now 4 years later, Stork'd has helped a lot of people. A lot of people enjoy it. I hope you're enjoying it. And I now have a 2.5-year-old son who's amazing. I'm loving being a solo mom. The lifestyle is really working for me. I'm choosing to have a second. I'm going through fertility treatments. And Stork'd is at a point where I need to talk about our access to whether or not we can continue to make our families in the way that we want to. One of the scariest things to me as a mom is that I know that if I were trying to have my son a couple years from now, I might not be able to have him. So I look at this precious, gorgeous, amazing, brilliant child, and I know that I got to have him because I chose to do so at a time when I still had access to reproductive freedoms. They still had access to IVF. But what if all those rights go away? My son wouldn't exist. My next child might not exist. Your daughter's children or your son's children or your niece or your best friend or your neighbor, those children might not exist if IVF goes away. It's really scary. So I'm feeling, on this day, on this July 4th, America's birthday, I'm just feeling so fearful that the people that we love who are going through so many hurdles to create their families might never get to have those families. And that the generation behind them may never get the access to these resources to build their families. We may never get to have the family lives that we get to enjoy right now. So I'm exploring ways to engage in those conversations for us all as part of the Stork'd community to engage in those conversations, those meaningful conversations around what do our family building choices look like now and what will they look like in the future? And what does this year, this 2024 election year mean for those choices? I'm hoping to bring some of those interesting conversations to the Stork'd audience soon. As you can tell, I'm really passionate about it, but it's a little overwhelming. It's a little daunting. I mean, this has never been a political podcast. It's always been about the heart and soul of our families and specific and individual journeys. And my heart and soul is just so broken right now. And it is so saddened and so astonished that these changes are happening amongst us that I think many of us don't even really understand. We don't understand how it is that contraception could be at risk. Contraception is the thing that allows us to choose when and how and if we have a family. What does our family life look like in the US if we don't have access to contraception? So many of us don't fully appreciate that having great medical care is the thing that keeps us or our babies alive. And that great medical care depends on having doctors who aren't afraid to practice medicine in our state, who are legally allowed to practice medicine in the state, who are allowed to give you life-saving care in your state. And that is no longer true in many of the states in the US. Building our families means that if you are facing infertility for any reason, whether it's age and diminished ovarian reserve in my case, or maybe you had to go through life-saving cancer treatment, there's so many things that can impact our fertility. So many things. And IVF fertility treatment and access to reproductive health is the thing that gives us our families. How many people in my life and in yours have had babies through IVF or through IUI? Babies would not exist if IVF goes away. We wouldn't have access to building our families that way. And the most wonderful people in the world that I know, kids and adults, would not exist right now without these treatments. What happens if we no longer can get divorced? If zero-fault divorce goes away, we are stuck in abusive relationships. If we have to fight to leave relationships, these things are really scary to me. It all comes down to who gets to choose your family life. Is it you? Is it finding your true north and thinking really about what kind of family you want? Or is it our politicians and our lawmakers? That's really scary. So I'm exploring ways to bring great conversations around these topics to the Stork'd audience. Stay tuned. I hope to have some interesting content for you very soon. And in the meantime, if you have it in your heart, cross your fingers and send baby dust and well wishes to me as I continue to embark on my IVF journey for baby number 2. Promise to share more about that in the future. But today, on America's birthday, I just hope that we're all thinking about the freedoms that we are so lucky to have access to right now, and enshrining those freedoms so that we can continue to have access to them in the future.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.